Welcome to the Soul Grit podcast. I'm Ann Taylor McNeese, and I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. I also love Jesus, and I'm passionate about all things gospel and therapy. I created Soul Grit to be at the intersection of mental health and Christian faith. Christ followers need a place to ask questions and get answers about mental health. Join me as we dive into real stories and real questions from people who want to honor God with their hearts, souls, and minds. Hi, welcome back to the Soul Grit podcast. This is Anne, and I'm here today with Emily Flowers. Hi, Emily.
Hi, Anne. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, this is going to be a good conversation today because Emily and I are both moms of neurodivergent kids, and we're both Christians who are struggling through our faith and talking to God and figuring things out. So Emily's here because I found her on Instagram, and she has a lovely page called Neuroradiant, right?
Yep.
Neuroradiant. And on her page, she talks about how God is ministering to us through our neurodivergence and just gives encouragement to us when, our brains work differently than the neurotypical person. So, Emily, let's just kind of define our terms real quick. So, how do you define neurodivergence?
Great question. I feel like it's kind of, I wouldn't say it's fluid, but I have kind of two categories just because of my own experience. I've got autism in my family, so an ADHD and a learning disability.
Mm-hmm.
So I definitely have like developmental disability is part, obviously, of that. So it's one of the categories. We also have psychiatric disabilities in our family. So we have schizoaffective disorder, we have obsessive compulsive disorder, and then some mood stuff going on. So it's not that I would say it's fluid, but I would say it's a little elastic maybe for me because I see that if we're really talking about neurodiversity, that includes me. I'm neurotypical. That includes my daughter who's autistic, and also the psychiatric disorders that we have in there too. Everyone's brain is along for the ride. So I'm not sure if that kind of answers your question, but basically neurodiversity is, to me, or neurodivergence is brains that work differently than perhaps what is typical.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. Like anything neuro means it's the brain. And divergent means like we have a kind of an idea of how most brains work, and then some brains work differently.
Mm-hmm.
But I think probably what you and I are both discovering is that everybody's brains are diverse.
Mm-hmm.
Right? There's no two brains that work alike. And maybe if we are both neurotypical, we have a lot of similarities and we can function in the world as it's made pretty easily. But we all have our differences. And so there's some of us, though, that just have differences that make it a little bit harder to work in the world as the world exists. And so some of the things that you mentioned, like autism spectrum disorder, and of course, saying it's a spectrum means it could be you're just a little quirky, or it could be like you cannot communicate, you don't have language, or you're not able to take yourself to the restroom. Like it could be very disabling, let's say. So,
and in different, profiles, like one, you may be non-speaking, but you may have really stellar executive functioning skills, or your executive functioning skills may be very on the lower end, but you're super socially motivated and speaking and very articulate. So something I saw recently that I love was, instead of describing it as like a linear spectrum, that it's different dials on a stove.
Yes,
and
I was just
you may have something turned up real high, again, like sensory sensitivity, and then something else, maybe your executive functioning is only a little bit different. So I really liked that because my daughter she's autistic, and she's very socially motivated, she's very socially interested, She's very articulate. And so people often will say, oh, she's high functioning,
Mm,
but she struggles to use the bathroom on her own. She has to take multiple pairs of clothes to school.
mm.
Showering and bathing can take a couple hours, and so she's high functioning in one
In some
sense,
ways,
not
yeah.
necessarily in other. And I think that's something that just to add to what you were saying of if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism, and to not make assumptions about their strengths and weaknesses because of another strength or weakness, if that makes sense.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, I really like that stove one. I saw somebody on Instagram, like, standing at her stove showing how, like, the dials are turned up. But I also even seen it as, like, a constellation almost,
Mm,
like, OCDs maybe somewhere on there, or learning disorders are somewhere on there, like, in
yeah.
different psychiatric diagnoses. Just make it so that we operate in the world a little bit differently, and
Mhm.
no two people are exactly the same. Although we do see some similarities, otherwise we couldn't make a diagnostic category. So
Right. Totally.
often, like, sensory issues are one of the categories. Communication issues is typically one. Like you said, whether you're socially motivated or you could care less about people, that tends to be one. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what we're talking about today. Is just like all of our brains work differently, and sometimes that makes it really hard for us to function in the world if our culture or our society is saying this is what you need to do to be successful.
Mhm.
So, for example, communication skills. It's really hard to get a good job if you don't have great communication skills, right? But you might be a whiz at computer coding, or working in a lab where you can see really, like, intricate details of
Mhm.
something, but you don't know how to communicate your findings. And
Mhm.
so thinking about how we can help make the world a little bit more flexible is part of the reason that we're here, I think.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think you and I, because my daughter will say sometimes, "Oh, I think maybe you have ADHD." I'm like, "What? I don't know. Like, I can focus pretty well, but I think, like you said, everybody's brains are different.
Mhm.
But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that you and I are mostly neurotypical." And we do have neurotypical people in our families, but then
Mhm.
we're really getting exposed to this world because it's people that we love whose brains are working differently.
Mhm.
So tell me a little bit about just how you came to this experience of discovering these people that you love
Yeah.
being something different.
So, yeah, my daughter Evelyn, we call her Evie. She's the one who has really opened my eyes, and really my whole family would say that that she has been used to soften our hearts and grow in empathy and compassion and this like expanding view of what it means to be a person made in God's image. So she started when she was very, very young. She was 3 into 4 with some pretty rigid and uh, highly specific routines. So the one that is that we always remember is was her goodbye routine, where you had to hug, kiss on the cheek, blow a kiss. It had to be in a certain order, a certain number of times. If you patted her on the back in the wrong spot during the hug, you had to start over. And if this was not completed, it would turn into a very long and intense meltdown. This
Mhm,
started with loved ones, and then it grew to the point where we would be at a restaurant and she would want the waitress to do this routine.
mhm,
So having other psychiatric diagnoses in our family, specifically OCD, we kind of, our proverbial ears kind of perked up, and we thought, okay, we need to kind of pay attention to this. This was all brand new, though, to me
mhm,
personally. And so I pursued my own counselor to kind of just start to think, how do I think biblically about um, you know, disease of the brain, really. Like her brain's not working correctly. How does this link with our faith? Where is sin and what is weakness? And all these, where do we need to call to trust God, and where do we need to perhaps get some therapy and medication involved? And So that kind of started my journey. And then she's fiery. She has red hair. She's a fiery little girl, and she has been through the ringer. So not all of these diagnoses have stuck, but these are the ones that she has been, just to kind of give you an idea of some of her symptoms. She's been diagnosed with ADHD, OCD, bipolar disorder, schizoaffective disorder, and autism.
Mm.
So she has, and a lot of that, I think the doctors didn't know because she's so young. She's only 8, and this all started when she was 4. So now what we're primarily, anyway, so all that to say, my journey has just been, I'm a learner. I like to learn. I cope by researching and understanding and books. And so that's kind of what I did. And I also, I believe in Jesus, and I believe that everything in this world is interpreted through the lens of scripture, and I know that nothing is not touched by his grace and his wisdom. And so I just started this journey of trying to combine what I was learning, common grace, um, gifts really of secular psychology and ERP and all these different things, and then the word and scripture. And so now, just to kind of round that out, the primary things that we're working with my daughter are autism and schizoaffective disorder are her primary diagnoses. However, she does, when she's not medicated for her OCD, that gets very, very loud.
Mm.
Her OCD can get very loud. And then, she's very hyperactive. She's got a lot of sensory issues. So we've got the ADHD in there. But primarily what we're working on is the autism and the schizoaffective disorder.
Mhm. Mhm. And for most people, I think like schizoaffective is not like a very familiar diagnosis, but it just
Yeah.
happened that the last podcast episode we had, we talked a little bit about that one. So just
Yeah.
to remind people that that is like schizophrenia in the sense that there's some removal from what's real, right?
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
I'm not sure with your daughter, she has hallucinations or she hears or sees things that aren't there or has paranoia or whatever that might be.
All of the above.
Okay, okay, so there's that.
She's treated for it, and her psychiatrist is amazing, and
Okay.
those psychotic symptoms have resolved, but she's had all of those things pretty intensely. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a lot for such a little girl. And then the affective part of that disorder is like the mood
Hmm.
symptoms, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Well,
Yeah. So like the periods of mania, heightened um energy, not sleeping, that, and then periods of depression, of
mhm.
crying, sleeping a lot, yeah, that whole thing. So that kind of comes with it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's quite a lot for such a young person.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you have another daughter,
I
right?
do. Yep,
Yeah.
Betsy, Elizabeth, we call her Betsy. And she is neurotypical, and she is 7 years old. And, you know, she goes through a lot also because she loves her sister very much. And she also is very much impacted by the brokenness.
Mhm.
She's the target a lot
Mhm.
for a lot of her sister's behaviors. And so she's kind of balancing this, kind of straddling this fence of, this is my best friend, this person hurts me.
Yeah.
Not necessarily physically, but just it's a hard thing. And it's hard as a mom to watch that, to see both of your kids suffering and
Mhm.
not being able to always be everything to them. I can't hold them together. And I think that's something that maybe you relate to as a mom
Yeah.
of children who have neurodivergence, that I think it's true of all parents, that we're not enough for our kids, that only Jesus is, that we are not the ones holding their worlds together, Jesus is. But I think when you have a child who suffers acutely,
Mhm.
um, that reality is way more in your face.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
wrestling with that, I'm not enough and I need to be okay with that because I know that he is. And of course, that's a long journey, but that's something with my younger one that I feel often that I'm reflecting on and trying to learn and grow in.
Mhm. How do you talk about neurodivergence in your family?
Um, so for a long time, any kind of difference was called OCD
Oh, okay.
to my kids
That's
because
like every kind of meat at my table is called chicken. So
yes, exactly. So we did not. do that, but it kind of was like when they were so little, it was, you know, Betsy, my little one, would say, Evie isn't, the way she would talk about it is Evie isn't feeling good in her brain or in her mind. She would say she's not feeling good in her mind. And to her, because OCD was the first diagnosis,
Mhm.
everything was OCD.
Mhm.
And so that is how it was for a while. We've gotten past that now, but yeah. So now we really talk about how different people, just kind of how we talked about it in the beginning, that everyone's brain works differently, and that brings different strengths and different weaknesses. And some things are harder for some people than others, and some are easier. My daughter Evelyn has an incredible memory.
Mm.
She can remember what song my husband's cousin danced to at her wedding in when she was like 4 years old. She comes on the radio and she's like, "This is what Karen danced to." She knows.
Oh my goodness.
She has an incredible memory, but she couldn't clean her room to save her life. Like, so we know that different it works differently, and I think that for the more psychiatric symptoms, we have just I think that language of she doesn't feel good in her mind.
Mhm.
Um, Evie's not feeling good is the way she describes it, because my younger one, she does know that she can't help a lot of what's happening, that she is behaving the way that she's behaving because she is suffering. When she's got voices telling her things, that's hard, that's suffering. And so Betsy knows that, but obviously she can't conceptualize it fully.
Yes.
So that's kind of the way we have learned to talk about it, is I'll say, sometimes your belly hurts. That's what happens with my daughter a lot when things are intense. Betsy, my younger one, her belly hurts. And so I'll say, sometimes you know how your belly hurts. That's, sometimes Evie's brain hurts and it's not, doing what it's supposed to do. And when your belly hurts, you throw up.
Mhm.
And when your brain hurts, you melt down and you scream
Yes.
and things get out of control. So I'm sure it'll be an evolving conversation. But we've tried to be very open about it. And because I don't want Evie, to feel ashamed that this is something that needs to be hidden. Um, it's it's not something to be ashamed of. It's not something that is her fault. Um, but we also want that for Betsy. I
Yeah.
want her to be able to grow in compassion and to understand that from the outset, people are different and we love them.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know if that makes sense.
Well, yeah, of course. I think one thing, because my oldest has ADHD, attentive type, and one thing that has really helped her come to grips with that diagnosis and what it means she can do well and what it means she can't do well and where she's going to struggle. One of the things that's helped us is just to be following accounts on Instagram where
Mm,
people talk about their
yeah,
ADHD and
yeah,
they make funny videos that that relate to ADHD and or share tips that help you know. And so because we spend a lot of time looking at those kinds of videos, there's you'll learn a lot of new language
yeah,
basically around like how are people talking about it. And
yeah,
so but my kids know what neurodivergence means, what neurotypical
yes.
means. um, but there are also people out there who give it kind of like nicknames that my kids think
Uh-huh,
are funny. So for my daughter, sometimes we call it neurosparkly.
uh-huh, yeah,
I've also heard people call it neurospicy.
yeah,
So when my middle son, who is 12, his diagnosis was fairly recent, just for educational purposes, autism spectrum. And he said, well, could I call it neuro deadly? Because he's a little boy and he wants to be like something dangerous, you know?
yes.
And I was like, no, I don't think actually
I don't think we're gonna go with that.
neuro deadly does not sound like a good option, but we can keep working on that.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So it
That's
is,
where neuroradiant comes from,
that's
actually.
perfect.
Yeah.
Well, why don't you
Um,
talk about that a little bit? Because I want to get into that.
yeah. So a couple years ago in 2022, my husband had a pretty severe work accident.
Mm.
He's a lineman, and he had second and third degree burns from his neck all the way down to his thighs. He was in the
Ooh.
ICU, 5 skin grafts. It was quite a time. We didn't know, if he would make it or not. So, during that time, I obviously was really struggling, just holding things together at home. A lot of my Evie's mood instability was coming out at that time. So we were dealing with like massive meltdowns, and there was just so much going on. And I was really not doing well. And I went to a CCEF conference. It was the one on wisdom. It was a couple years ago. And one of the sessions was on the Psalm 34:5. Those who look to him will be radiant, and their faces will never be put to shame. And my mom and I went together. This is like a thing we do together, is go to these conferences. And
Mm.
we were talking, and in the conversation, like I just we were at a restaurant, and I just broke down crying because it was like, I am not radiant. Like I what the vibes that I am putting are not shiny. I am not radiant. I am like, I was struggling to wear makeup because it made me feel like a clown. I was sad, and I wasn't radiant. I just wasn't in myself. And so we were really talking about that, and I was really wrestling with that verse because I felt like, I am trusting God. I do trust him. Is it hard? Yes. Do I like it? No. But I did trust him. I hadn't lost that faith, and so I just was confused. How can these two things be true at the same time, that I'm trusting? I have not turned my back, but I'm a mess. I'm a mess. And so I kind of took a deep dive into that text, which led and into the Psalms and lament and all of those things. And it led to a women's retreat actually the following year that I spoke at. And the conclusion that I came to was, those who look to him are radiant, not because they are smiling and happy and always projecting these positive vibes, and they're not shiny, happy, radiant people necessarily. But when we look to him, even if you're ugly crying and your makeup is down your face, or you're not wearing makeup, whatever the situation is, if you're looking to him, it's his glory that reflects off of our faces. And so we then are radiant, not from our own light, but from the light that we receive from looking to him. And that in doing so, that hope and that trust and looking to him, it won't be put to shame, because you do get carried. And that's what, so that deep dive into the Psalms, I used to look at the Psalms and be like, oh, it's poetry, it's feel good, whatever. It's not feel
It's not.
good. It is not. And so that journey through lament, that taking that path through pain and learning to look to God, talk to God with everything, every ugly thought, and bring it to him with this posture of, I'm waiting
Mm.
on you. Um, that radiant kind of became like a theme in my life of, what does it mean to be radiant? And so anyway, as I started writing more, out of my experiences with my daughter, and kind of reconciling the truth of God's good, love, and sovereignty, and the suffering that we have here, I just was like, you know what? Her story and the stories of people that experience neurodivergence and psychiatric disorders, they have a unique radiance. They have a
Mm.
unique opportunity to show off the beauty and the glory of God,
Mhm.
um, and in their particular weaknesses, their particular strengths. But I think, my kids are young. And so the thing that we're facing right now, I recognize that people that are neurodivergent have a lot of strengths. My kids are young, and it has been primarily hard. They have primarily suffered, I would say. And we are learning to find the strengths, but it has been mostly hard.
Mm.
Um, and so, anyway, combining those themes, I just recognized the unique ability that people who suffer have to shine in God's light, and how it almost can become this even more beautiful thing. Contrast is what makes something beautiful in art. I'm not an artist, but I know that that is true.
Mhm, mhm.
And so when you have this brokenness with this beautiful trust and light, I think it's a unique opportunity. And so that's kind of where Neuro Radiant came from.
Yeah. Well, that's beautiful. I'm glad that you shared about that verse and how that you just wrestled with that over a long period of time to come to that understanding that God wants to make you radiant
Mhm.
and that's available to you. So, talk a little bit about the content that you're publishing on that page.
Yeah, so the Instagram is really I'm not super good at social media,
Same.
or it's never been a big thing in my life. However, I do realize that that's how people communicate with the world these days. And so it started out as just a blog where I kind of thought and reflected as I started writing. Let me back up. As I started writing again, to process some of my own thoughts, I kind of reflected on the fact that it's the ramblings of others who are walking this road of being touched by neurodivergence and mental illness, and who are walking that road with Jesus, and also walking the road of faith, and how that has been literally like a life-giving drink of water in really hard times. And I just kind of felt, I have this on my page, it's I just felt the sting of conviction of kind of keeping that my own ramblings to myself, because if you're listening to this and you have kids or family members or you yourself suffer, there's really not a ton of faith-based material out there. I mean, it is there, but there's not a ton. And it can be very lonely. And so I just felt like, you know what, why should I be keeping this to myself? So I ran it by some close trusted people and they said, yeah, let's do it. Publish it. So so that's kind of how the blog started. And so the content on there is a lot of it's stuff that I'm wrestling through. It's not, coming from a place of my kids are still young and we're still going through it. Like this isn't, oh, I've made it to my kids are grown and they're in college, and these are the things that I learned. It's
Mhm,
this is what I am currently learning and wrestling through. So a lot of it's not polished in the sense that a firm conclusion is reached, but it is. I started out with a series in the Psalms because that's where I learned how to take my pain to God and to continue trusting Him as opposed to allowing my pain to turn into silence that turned into death. Uh, for lack of a better way of saying it.
mhm,
And so, yeah, so there's one series on there. It's called the Autism Bucket, and that is just little drips. If you read kind of the intro,
mm,
it's just you can't implement 50 strategies at one time. You kind of have to take it one truth, one strategy at a time. And so I kind of, as I'm learning and growing and walking with my daughter who has autism, I'm adding to that bucket there. And then there's the Psalm series, and then most recently the Let's Talk About Psychiatric Disorders, where I talk about like foundations for thinking biblically about them, how to conceptualize them, three truths to help us kind of get a little bit deeper in how am I supposed to think about OCD, bipolar, all these different things. And then the last one is takeaways. Like what difference does this make? How
mhm,
can I grow? How can I be sanctified in the way that I'm loving people with psychiatric disorders? So that's where it is now.
mhm.
So the Instagram really just is meant to be like a signpost to the blog.
Yeah, yeah. Mm, and I appreciate what you post on the Instagram because it is like little tiny nuggets, right? But it's not just like you were saying with the Psalms, it's not like, oh, happy poetry. It's like this is hard.
Yeah.
And also Jesus.
Yes,
you know?
exactly. Yeah.
And so how can we point our own hearts back to like God has a plan for this or
Hmm.
God loves how you are. God loves how Evie is,
Hmm.
And God hurts when she hurts.
Yeah.
He has a plan for this in her
Yeah.
life and in yours.
Yeah. It's helped me to bring things to them. Like, I talk with both of them a lot about the psalm where it says that he bottles our tears,
Mhm.
which means he's very close. Like to get a tear from your face, like you're right up
Yeah.
close.
Yeah.
And how he bottles them. So he's close. And also, why would you bottle something? It's because it's precious,
Precious.
it's valuable. Um, and so not only is he close enough to catch them, but he cares enough to carry them. And so I think it's life giving to me, and it's also accessible to children at
Mm.
different levels.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Giving them some of those like visual images.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. That's great.
Yeah.
Well, I'd like you to just, tell people how they can find your blog and how they can follow along with what you're doing in case they need some encouragement in this area.
Okay, so the Instagram is the handle, I guess. Is that what it's called?
Yeah.
I don't see,
Yeah.
I'm terrible at this. I don't even know what it's called. The handle is neuro, so Neuro dot radiant, Radiant.
Mhm.
And the blog is neuroradiant, no dot in the middle, so just straight neuroradiant dot blog. And
Okay.
then when you get on there, there's like the homepage, but then you can click at the top, it says the blog, and then the posts are there in, chronological order. On the sidebar of the homepage is where you can click on the series. So if you were
Oh, great.
interested in the autism bucket, you could click right on that. If you're interested
Mhm.
in psychiatric disorders, you could click that. The Psalms one is called the Prayer Book of the Neurodiverse.
Oh, nice.
And so that would be that one. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, for anybody listening, I'm going to have those links posted in the show notes so you can easily click over to see everything that Emily's doing and get some encouragement. I'm guessing if you're listening to this podcast, either you or someone you know has gone through one of these diagnoses or had a period of their life where they've struggled. And so this can be a really good encouragement for you and the people in your family just to help you wrap your mind around why do we have this suffering in the world? Why is God allowing it? What does he want to do in your heart through this? And then just to be encouraged to keep trusting him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The Psalms one opens with this idea of being a watchman. And that's been a major image in my life of being a watchman and waiting and knowing that the morning comes and leaning into that. And I recently did a study in Habakkuk, and he says, I'm going to wait on the watch tower like a watchman, and I'm going to see what God will answer me. And
Yeah.
basically, he says, and I'm going to see how God will rebuke me. And if you look, I kind of did a little bit deeper into the Hebrew, and it's how God will correct me. And so he's like, please help me think better about this because I am desperate. I am desperate. And so then God responds and he says, here it is, write the vision. I'm going to make it plain so that he who reads it may run. And so it has this idea of perseverance and that he who sees this, who's waiting and hearing God's correction may run. And I think that is a big part of the heart of the blog is we I personally have come to realize like I need my thinking to be corrected if I'm going to be able to get through this because the fact that I don't understand how God can be good and my child can suffer in this way, it doesn't make any sense to me. So God, I need my brain. I need
Yeah.
you to fix my thinking.
Yeah.
Um and in some ways he has and in some ways I'm still a watchman. So if you identify, if you're listening to this and you're in the trenches
Mhm.
and that feels encouraging or comforting to you to kind of adopt that identity as a watchman and waiting for God to illuminate your path, maybe one step at a time until glory when it will all be revealed. That's kind of what you'll find there.
Mm.
That was a
Yeah.
long way of saying that.
Yeah.
I have a
Well,
long
and
way of saying everything.
And for those listening, I don't think we mentioned this at the beginning, but Emily does have a seminary background and has taught people how to read the Bible and how to study. And so that is something that you will see shine through in the work that she writes. And it's not just some mom that's like, oh yeah, I read the Bible one time, but she's actually a student and a teacher. So Emily, thank you so much for sharing all of that. I know it's very raw still.
Hmm.
Like you're still going through it, as you mentioned, and you will be for the foreseeable future. And so thank you for being so brave. I think that
Thank you.
makes you radiant.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I didn't always feel brave.
Yeah. Well,
I
tell
don't
us,
always still feel brave now, so I appreciate that.
what are you doing for soul care?
I'm actually reading. I needed something that was super open and go
Yeah.
done for me. I have always done very deep, like you said, I went to seminary. And so my Bible study has always been like exegesis. And, like I've always gone really deep on my own with just the Bible and my notebook. And in the last couple years, as my bandwidth has
Yeah.
significantly reduced for things, I felt like I kind of compared it at the time to like when you're married and everything's going great and you have time to talk over dinner, and then you have kids and now your relationship with your spouse has changed. Then you're like, okay, I don't know how to relate to you anymore because we don't our lives have changed. We used to go to museums, now we go to the playground. Like it's just
Yep.
whatever. And I feel like that happened to me with God, where I just was like, I know that we still are in relationship, but it's so different. Like I cannot get up at 4 a.m. every morning to have that time. So I struggled through that a lot. And what God kind of, he held my hand through that. So anyway, all that to say, I have become okay with letting someone else help me
Mm,
and
imagine
offer
that.
me daily bread. Yeah, it's crazy, right? And so right now I'm working through Paul Tripp's. It's Everyday Gospel
Yeah.
Bible, I think it's called. And it's so good. It's work through the Bible in a year. I will not get through it in a year. But that's okay. It's a couple chapters and then he gives some reflection on it. It's all in one place, so you're not juggling multiple books. I love that. So I'm doing that in the mornings. I work really hard to get up before the girls and start
Mhm.
my day by myself with God.
Mhm.
Um, I also move my body. I have to
Yeah.
move my body. And I try to prioritize that when I can. But yeah,
What kind of
um,
movement do you like?
I practice yoga, which
Okay.
I know has a lot of differing opinions about yoga. And so I always hesitate to say, but it's movement in my body. And I take a lot of hot yoga classes and it's so good.
Mhm.
That like sweat and that effort and just kind of like that release has been so good
Good.
for me. So yeah, that and my Bible and reading whenever I can. That's what I do.
Nice.
Lots of tea.
Okay. Good. Well, thank you so much for sharing. And I hope that people are pointed over to your page so they can be encouraged and just kind of join in the struggle with you. Um, so thank
Thank
you
you. Thank you
for
so much for
today.
having me. I appreciate it.
The Soul Grit podcast is a production of Soul Grit Resources. You can find more at soulgritresources.com or on the socials at Soul Grit Resources. You can email me at info@soulgritresources.com.